kingdom polemics exist to equip the church for battle against the kingdom of darkness in light of the particular threats of our day. Kingdom polemics is about taking the cosmic, Christological concepts of the Scottish Reformed and connecting it to the ground. How you doing, Kingdom Polemics audience, friends, family, haters? Some people watch this because they don't like the content, but they want to, like, I don't know, snoop around or something. This is a mixed audience. But today I was prompted by something that I wasn't planning on talking about that I'm going to talk about, and it is Mr. Pastor Dever's comments about Presbyterians and their polity and their view of sacraments. And let me just say that this is not what Mr. Dever or Pastor Dever articulated. It's not some, oh my goodness, like, did he really say that? This is what a lot of Credo Baptist, Credo Baptist, and Baptist, whatever, they believe. So he didn't say anything that was, wow, I can't believe you said that. He did say it in a very candid way, which is why everybody was laughing. But the reason why I thought it would be appropriate to do, by the way, I'm not going to do a normal episode where it's going to be like an hour, 45 minutes to an hour and a half. I hope not. I don't want to do that, but we'll see. Is because I feel like his response and interaction with elements of Reformed theology, particular elements, I feel like it is very indicative of what is wrong in evangelicalism in general as they interact in all the spheres of our society. So the way that Dever reacts to paedobaptism and connectional polity. So we have a form of government which is not independent. Churches govern themselves independently, and they could just kind of like have a friendship with other people. SBC is not really a denomination. It's more of just a bunch of acquaintances that choose to share money. But it's not a denomination in the sense of them being truly connectional in the way they govern. So I think that there is something in this response that is very telling about what is wrong in the church as they see not just the church, but everything else. And while I know that there's many people that would probably be like, what are you talking about? Because I'm Paedobaptist. But I believe that there is Baptist spirituality that is very much crept its way into even the Reform world. And so this expression here that is not obviously embraced by a lot of Presbyterians, but I think this perspective that Baptists have to things like this can creep itself into a lot of elements, I believe, of all sorts of traditions. So let me just play, it's really short. Let me just play, and we'll start with that.
That's what the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics taught.
I guess it was a phone.
But the Anabaptists for sure had that as a core, cardinal component of their identity.
Yes, as the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics did. It was the Paedobaptist Protestants who missed that point.
But they had a wrong view of how you got regenerate.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Maybe I
But I
should
just want to say this idea of a regenerate church, our Presbyterian friends will look at us sometimes like we're crazy people. And I want to say, excuse me, that's what the East and Rome always taught.
Yes.
They understood that when you were baptized as an infant, you were regenerated. So actually the crazy people in the room are you guys who are saying there is a church full of unregenerate people.
All right, so this is interesting. Very interesting, because Dever says that the only people that have separated church membership have separated conversion, regeneration from the sacrament. So you can kind of connect those two. You separate regeneration, not separate. I don't think that's fair, but you distinguish is a better way of saying it. But the way they say it, you separate regeneration from a sacrament. You separate church membership from being regenerate. And what he's saying is that nobody did that. If you were baptized by Rome, you were regenerate. You were a member of the church because you were regenerate and baptized. So Rome would not separate regeneration, being saved. Now, obviously, their view of salvation is a different thing. They would not separate salvation from membership in the sign. The Greek Orthodox. And I find him making a connection with the Baptists and the Anabaptists and the Rome and Greek Orthodox tradition fascinating. Because I have thought that many times. Rome and the Greek Orthodox and even the Episcopalians and the Baptists, they both cannot separate or distinguish the sign from the reality. So to be baptized is to be believing. You cannot be baptized and not be regenerate and believing. Now, obviously, the way that Baptists understand the way you come to faith, they don't believe in baptismal regeneration. However, Dever's point is that nobody understood that there could be a separation between being a member of a church, between being baptized, and you not being regenerate and having saving faith. So the Baptists would say, we're baptized because we've been regenerate before and have saving faith. And the sacerdotal world of the papists and the quasi-papists and even the Lutherans, no, in the administration of the sign comes faith and regeneration. The way that the baptismal regeneration conversation is processed by Lutherans and Catholics is different, but it's not radically different. But here's the point. Dever is making a connection between regeneracy and signs and church membership that the Baptists in their own way share with the Roman world. And this is fascinating to hear him say because the reformers saw the Anabaptists like quasi-Romans, Roman Catholics. They saw much continuity with the Anabaptists and the Roman theology. As a matter of fact, they believe that a lot of the arguments against them that the Papists had, the Anabaptists had. And here's the issue with Baptists in their own way and other people like the Greek Orthodox and Rome, is they collapse in different ways the sign with the reality. So how can you have the sign and not have the reality? And in the Reformed tradition, we understand that there is a connection between the sign and the reality, but there is a distinction. And so here's where the conversation starts with the Baptists, is that there is no purpose for outward administration, for outward participation in church membership, for the administration of signs. There is no purpose whatsoever in these things of church membership and signs if you don't have regeneration. And they totally undermine what Paul says in Romans 3. Paul says, what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? So Paul is addressing the issue, all right, in chapter 2 of Jews that are purely outward Jews. They are not inward Jews. They are not spiritual Jews. They are simply outwardly participating. And so, as Paul trashes that as not being soteriologically significant, he then answers the question, is this significant at all? And he says, is there any advantage to being a Jew if you are merely externally and outwardly participating? And he says in verse 2, much in every way. To begin this, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? So he says, listen, there is something real, necessary, importance, and significance of outward participation with external realities. Okay? And so in our standards, unlike the Baptists, unlike Rome, and unlike the Episcopalians, who this baptism thing, this church membership thing, we cannot conceive it apart from regeneration and faith. Unlike them, here's what we say. And I guess if you want to brag about being in the stratosphere of Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church, and you want to say that the reformers are the difference, I'm happy to take that difference. So look what it says on baptism in point 5 in this chapter on baptism. Although it is a great sin to condemn or neglect this ordinance, yet grace and salvation are not so inseparably annexed to it, so as no person can be regenerated or say without it, or that all are baptized or undoubtedly regenerated. Okay, so baptism is serious. It's serious to neglect it. It is important, but salvation and grace in a saving sense is not inseparably annexed to it. Unlike the Baptists say, how can you administer the sign if there isn't regeneracy and salvation? And the Romans make the baptism regeneration, and the fellow visionists do this as well. The reformers say, this is real, this is important, but the reality and the sign don't always go together as you administer it. And in point 6, it expands that thought. It says, the efficacy of baptism is not tied to that moment of time wherein it is administered. The timing when it's administered, all right, and the efficacy are not bound together. So you can conceive of and understand the administration of a sign that does not demand efficaciousness in the timing of it. Yet, notwithstanding by the right use of this ordinance, the grace promise is not only offered, but really exhibited and conferred by the Holy Ghost to such whether of age or infants as such grace belongs unto, according to the counsel of God's own will in his appointed time. There is real grace offered here, real grace conferred here, not based upon the timing of the sign, but based upon the appointed time when the Holy Spirit applies the reality declared in that in his timing where he gives you faith. So when the Spirit makes it effectual, the sign, which is purely external, becomes effectual. This is not complicated. This is why God would say to the Jews, you are circumcised, but you must appropriate. This is what he says in Jeremiah many times. You must appropriate the external reality which you are participating in internally. Okay? And this is something that in the Reformed tradition we understand very, very simply. With Rome doesn't get this. The fellow visionists don't get this. The Episcopalians and Lutherans don't get this. The Baptists don't get this. There are two ways to truly participate in the covenant of grace in the church membership. There always has been, and there always will be. This is why Hebrews 6, speaking of the new covenant Christian, says it is impossible in chapter 6, in those cases who have once been enlightened who have tasted the heavenly gift and have shared in the Holy Spirit and have tasted the goodness of the word of God and the powers of the age to come and have then fallen away to restore them again to repentance. These people partook of membership. They partook of the means of grace. They partook of the powers of the coming age, but it was not internal participation. It was external. Later in Hebrews, it says, in chapter 10, how much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? You participated and were sanctified by the covenants, the blood of the covenant, but you have thrown it off. Now, Arminians say you were saved and you're unsaved. Baptists say you were a fake saved. We say you actually participated in the external administration of church membership and the means of grace, but you did not internally participate. This is why it's in Romans 11. Paul says, but if some of the branches are broken off and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among them and now share in the nourishing root of the olive shoot, do not be arrogant toward the branches. Okay? So in the same way that people participated in the rich fruit of the covenantal olive tree, Paul says, if you are, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root that supports you, then you will say branches were broken off so I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of unbelief, but you stand through faith. So don't become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. There are two ways to participate in the covenantal tree and actually be connected to it. You can participate externally, by which if you don't participate internally and appropriate the realities administered to you, you will be broken off. That's John 15. Or you can embrace the external reality and embrace the external participation and participate in the sap and the life of the rich olive tree, and you can benefit from it. This invisible, visible church membership that are not separated from each other, but certainly distinguished, makes the Reformed tradition the best expression of all the scriptures that explain church membership and signs. It's not complicated. There was an Israel within Israel. And if you think that was just an Old Testament anomaly, that inward-outward concept is expressed all throughout the New Testament. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 talks about they were all baptized into Moses, and they all drank the same spiritual food, and they all passed through the cloud, and yet some of them fell dead in the wilderness. They had external participation, all of them, in membership in the church, in the means of grace, at least for sure in the initiatory ones. And yet they fell dead. And this is an example and a paradigm for you, new covenant Christian. Okay? So, yeah, this is not complicated. These complications that are made by Baptists or Romanists are very easily worked out and understood. There is an outward administration of God's covenant of grace. There is an outward administration of the church and membership. And there is also an inward that are not collapsed into each other or separated from each other, but distinguished and connected. Let me keep playing this video.
It's just, as a guy in church history, Paedo-Baptist friends, I love you. You come and preach in our pulpit. You're smarter than we are. But I do get tired of being constantly condescended to by them when they're wrong. And they just don't understand the very things they claim to very well at all. The number of times I have been told we need bishops and presbyteries in case something goes wrong in our churches to make sure that our churches will be orthodox. Really? Really, have you looked at all the Orthodox Episcopal churches around? How about all the Orthodox PCUSA churches around? Have you bothered looking at those? Meanwhile, the Baptists who have no educational standards, but who require believer baptism.
Come on. Come on now, come on. You see people getting hyped? They're getting hyped, and they said, yeah, come on. Okay, so this is interesting. First of all, now he's making a case for why Congregationalism is superior to preserving orthodoxy and the gospel. Okay, and one thing he does right away, which is just shows how either he doesn't understand what he's saying, or he's just really hyped right now and in the moment. He says, I can't tell you how many people have talked about bishops and presbyteries, that has to be in play to preserve the gospel. First of all, Episcopacy and Presbyterianism is utterly, comprehensively, not even close to the same. So if you're going to talk about how these systems of government don't work, you better have two separate conversations about them. Because Episcopacy is a top-down form of government where the one above all speaks over and for the many. Presbyterianism is where the many speak as one in three concentric spheres. The many speak as one in the local church. The many speak at one in the regional church. The many speak at one in the synod, in the assembly that is bigger. That is very, 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 very different than Episcopacy and the bishop. The biggest hat speaks over the many. In Presbyterianism, there is no big hat. There is no hierarchy. There are the many speaking collectively as one in three concentric spheres, none of them being greater than the other. So if you're going to talk about how whack other polities are, you better have a very different conversation about Episcopacy than Presbyterianism. And here, let me just break down for those of you who are, not really into the whole, what's the whole thing with polity. Here's it is. Episcopacy, which has the Methodists and the Romans and the Greek Orthodox and the Episcopalians and the Anglicans. Now, obviously, there could be ranges. It's one speaking over and for the many. An elite person speaking over and for the many. Down. Congregationalism, which he's making a case for, is the many speaking as themselves individually. So one speaks like a pope over many. In Congregationalism, you have a bunch of popes who speak for themselves individually with their congregations. In Presbyterianism, you have many different peoples and churches speaking together collectively as one. And the whole conversation about, oh, you want us to be Presbyterian to preserve the gospel? Oh, look at the Anglican churches, and oh, look at the Orthodox, and oh, look at the PCUSA. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me with that argument? Are you kidding me? The reason why the PCUSA went bad was not because they had Presbyterian polity and confessions. It's because they departed from Presbyterianism, and instead of churches being governed by concentric circles of many officers speaking as one, they began to make elite groups of people and individuals speak behind the scenes over all the others. They began to function with this autonomy, with this elitism, with this kind of quasi-episcopacy, and they departed from their polity. The PCUSA is not where it's at because of its Presbyterian polity. It is there because it departed from its polity and departed from its standards and departed from covenant theology. Okay? That's nonsense. They departed from being truly Presbyterian, and therefore they are now heretical. Furthermore, Mark Dever's saying we have Baptist churches that don't have educational standards but baptize only adults. And there goes the apologetical reason as to why this is better. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? How many heretical Baptists are there in America? You know that. There are so many people that are congregational, that only baptize believers, that are liberal as heck and just as dead as a PCUSA. That's what the SPC has split. So if you're making a case for why having congregational polity is superior to the gospel, and look at the PCUSA, they are Presbyterian polity, and that's the argument. Well, guess what? There are much and maybe more heretical Congregationalists. That's not an argument. Stop it. Okay? Bring that stuff somewhere else. That's not an argument. And furthermore, if you're making a connection between not being educated and simply because you baptize adults, that's going to preserve you, that's also nonsensical. Preparation is always essential for anyone to be effective, right? And the idea that you could not be prepared, but just have the principle of independent government and baptizing only adults, and there goes preservation of the gospel. Are you kidding me? Do you know the nonsensical preaching in your churches by uneducated men who don't know what they're talking about? And you think they're all right because they just baptize adults? They don't even know what baptism is, other than you only give it to professing believers. They don't even know what it is because they're not prepared, okay? Furthermore, the idea that Congregationalism is superior to preserving the gospel. And therefore, if you want to preserve the gospel, you should be congregational. Okay. So let's just take the SBC as a micro. So in your denomination, you have dispensationalism that confuses the gospel. You have Arminianism, which believes in this shaky, you're in and you're saved and you're not saved in your denomination. You have charismatics, okay? That's so everyone being able to do that because of the independency of every church. That's a way to preserve the gospel. To have people, like Stephen Furtick, I guess he left a few minutes ago, have people like Stephen Furtick preaching a prosperity gospel because of the autonomy of the local church and not having to hold to the doctrines of grace. You can hold to the doctrines of grace or not. Rick Warren made an intriguing point. How are you going to not let me have a women preacher when you guys can differ on regeneration? Is it monergistic or synergistic? Are you saved once and for all by grace, or could you believe and not believe? How can you differ? That's a valid point. So everybody can be actually holding to the reform solas and the doctrine of grace or not, and that's okay in your congregations, and that is the means to preserve the gospel. Get out of here. Get out of here. That's insane. How many female pastors are there in the PCA? Oh, Congregationalism. It works so much well to preserve the gospel, and obviously the gospel is preached by the particular called people. How many female pastors are in the PCA? We had one woman preach in New York City in a church where she wasn't the pastor, and now they're getting popped. You have thousands of female pastors in your polity, and you're imputing the preeminence of gospel preservation and fidelity to Congregationalism. Yeah, you could be as Arminian as you want, and you could be as Calvinistic as you want about the gospel. And guess what? We're together because we only baptize adults, and we are independent government, and we cooperate. I mean, come on, this is absurd.
To be a member of their church. We have a church here from the 1770s that's still preaching the gospel.
Oh, we have a church that's really old, that's congregational, and baptizes only adults or professing believers. Bro, there's denominations and churches that go back 2 centuries in the Presbyterian world. What is your point? That's not a point. And simply because your church exists doesn't mean that it's because of your congregationalism. It could be in spite of it. It could be in the indulgence of God's grace. to overcome it. You can't say, well, this is really old, and therefore it's an apologetic for it being really good. Because a lot of things are really old that differ from that. These are weak arguments. Very weak arguments. And here's the thing. Mark Dever, this is their best public theologian. 9 marks and these guys, this is the chief theologian. Anyways.
If you want to protect the gospel, get rid of infant baptism and be congregational. Make the whole congregation vote. You'll keep the gospel.
Woo! Amen. All right. Hallelujah. So here's an interesting thought, okay? And look, I know Baptists listen to my stuff. I love you guys. And I think the reason why you appreciate our content, my content, is because you're a lot more Presbyterian than you're Baptist and you just don't know it yet. But, so here's the thing. Hey, if you want to preserve the gospel, have members vote. Be congregational and have members vote. So basically, if we're going to preserve the gospel, here's the logic. Instead of us having members vote their officers in who represent the church, and then govern the church by elders voting and elders voting with presbyters in the regional area, and also all the regions voting together. So basically, you're going to preserve the gospel simply by your congregation voting for things by yourselves, and that's better than us having congregations vote for their officers, and those officers vote together with themselves, and then they have to vote with a presbytery of other qualified called men who've been voted in, and they have to then vote together with all the regions. That's better to preserve the gospel? No, man. You're only as good as those people voting right there in those seats. We're as good as those beyond us. And by the way, we do have members vote. But once a member votes, the church is then governed not by ongoing voting of everybody. The idea is, you want to preserve the gospel? Have less people voting. By the way, this is less people voting. In the Presbyterian polity, for us to change something, it goes from local to regional to national to local to regional to national. For us to change something, it takes many more people voting, but it's not contingent upon one congregation having their members vote about everything. It's a silly argument. It's nonsensical. The idea that having less people vote and having members vote about more things in a local church and treating your kids like unbelievers until they prove themselves to be believers is going to preserve the gospel. I believe is just silly. How exactly does that preserve the gospel? One thing he says here is that baptizing only those who have professed faith, that will preserve the gospel. So you're out, children, until you prove yourself in. That preserves the gospel? Assuming that our children are not actually professing faith until they're 18 years old and they have done enough Christian piety, does that preserve the gospel? Does that undermine the gospel? Does you have a policy in your church that says that until you're 18 and have shown us enough Christianity, you can't identify with the gospel? Does that preserve the gospel or undermine the gospel? I think it undermines it. You said you have men in your church, and I'm not talking to him. This guy says he has men in his church who preach and are Presbyterian. Do you know that they can't take communion? Like when a guy like RC would go over there and preach, he couldn't take communion because he wasn't baptized as an adult. So you're telling me that your polity and your spirituality preserves the gospel by not allowing a blood-bought believer who is regenerate and serving as a pastor to participate in the signs of renewal because he has not administered the sign that preserves the gospel? No. Everything you guys do undermines the gospel in its fullness, not preserves it. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that Baptists don't preserve the gospel. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying is the Presbyterian view of these things has its most effectiveness in order to do so, and these things don't. Getting baptized every time you now think you're really a Christian because you had a bad season or because you didn't feel saved, that administering the sign of baptism over and over again, which is very much common in the back, that does not preserve the gospel. That undermines the gospel. Your baptism being valid based upon the amount of water you have, not the meaning of water, does that preserve the gospel or undermine the gospel? It absolutely undermines the gospel when you don't think that the meaning of the water and its significance is not a priority over how much water you put. You make more about the water and the amount than the meaning of the water and the reality. That does not preserve the gospel. Okay? And having a whole denomination based upon a view of baptism doesn't preserve the gospel. That is not something that I believe is of the utmost importance. There are just as many people saved that baptize their babies that those that don't. So to have a whole denomination based on a distinction that's not even of the essence of things is not preserving the gospel. Administering the signs of God's grace based upon what you see more than what God has said, more experientially, but based upon the senses and the proof, and less about the declarations, objective about what he has said. Let me tell you something. You know why we baptize our kids? Because God has sovereignly declared and made statements about the generation attached to us. And it's not based upon what we see, what we sense, but what God has said. Now, you tell me, what is more gospel preserving than having a view of sacraments that is administering based upon what God has sovereignly said objectively, not what we see? No, that doesn't preserve the gospel. Our view does. Okay? Because in Presbyterianism, baptism is more about what it says about God and less what it says about the one receiving it. And it's not that we don't believe there's internal realities that are understood in baptism. That's why in the confession it says baptism is a sign of our regeneration. But the emphasis is not on what baptism sometimes says about us. The emphasis in the Presbyterian world is what baptism always says about God. Baptism always says something about God's commitments to save and redeem. Baptism sometimes, when it's administered, says something about us. So us emphasizing the objectivity of the signs and not emphasizing, but not negating the subjectivity of the signs, that makes us less gospel-centered and gospel-preserving. No, you're wrong about that too. Furthermore, this idea that baptism administered only to professing adults or 16-year-olds or whatever age thing you have is more preserving than the gospel, that statement imputes sin and unbelief to God. Because God commanded, now, Cradle Baptists will disagree with us about the administration of signs to our children in the new covenant. But they will not debate us about administration of signs to children in the old administration of the covenant. They won't. Let's take the logic. You, Presbyterians, you're not going to preserve the gospel. You know why? Because you give signs to your kids by birth through their attachment to you and God's promises to the generations attached to you. You're not going to preserve the gospel because you give signs to your kids. What you are saying is that when God commanded the people of Israel to give signs to their kids, it was something that was going to lead to them denying the gospel. Are you serious? The Lord who made us and redeemed us commanded the signs of God's covenant to be administered to children before faith, and that was not antithetical to the propagation of the gospel, because nothing that God does is antithetical or contrary or dismissive of the gospel. All the Lord does is good and perfect. And if we say that signs to children undermines the gospel and its preservation, then you say that God undermined his own gospel for thousands of years by doing the same. Are you really going to say that? Are you really going to say that? Oh man, I think at this point, whenever this comes out, people are going to be like, I had to turn the volume down. Why not got a paintbrush in my hand? I had to turn the volume down because Aldo, like, you are so loud. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm a Presbyterian for the very reason that I believe that it preserves the gospel. So to hear this, it gets me a little heightened and intense. Okay, let me get this. Logic also: if you baptize unregenerate people, you're going to undermine the gospel. Guess what? Baptists baptize unregenerate people. You can't, obviously, you're not a Catholic, so you don't believe that every baptized person is regenerate. So you baptize thousands and thousands and thousands of unregenerate people. And so if the logic is baptize the unregenerate, therefore you will undermine the gospel, you have not solved that problem. Because as many as there are those who have been baptized as children and do not profess faith, and by the way, a lot of them do. A lot of them do. That's why half of your baptisms are some kid that was like, I wasn't a Christian. I thought I was a Christian. And then later in life, I became a Christian. That's a covenantal baptism delayed. Okay? You baptize a lot of people that don't come to faith. You have a bunch of 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds that were not Christians. And you baptize them again. That's fine. But not fine. Here's what preserves the gospel. It is not baptizing the unregenerate. Church discipline and holding people accountable to their baptism is what preserves the gospel in the church. There's an illustration that I think is very helpful. In the Baptist world, it's very hard to get into the club of the church. You have to prove yourself in there. But once you get in, there's not really a whole lot of people kicking people out for acting up. All right? So it's very hard. You gotta show you're a Christian to get in to the Christian club. But once you get in there, you got a bunch of people that got in, and there's not enforcement in when they're in. Now, there could be a hard way to get in and also enforcement, which would be good. But here's the thing. In the Presbyterian world, it's easier to get in. If you're born into a believing home, you are a part of the covenant. Externally, you are a member of the covenant. This is why God says that children are mine before they profess faith. I will be God unto you and your offspring. But guess what? There are some big old mean bouncers that's ready to kick you out when you start acting up. The preservation of the gospel is not based upon how hard it is to get in or easier it is to get in, but how Christianity is enforced by discipline in the walls of the church. If you enforce what God commands people who've been baptized to do, if you enforce that, then you will preserve the gospel. But I don't care how hard it is to get in. I don't care how easy it is to get in. If you are not holding people accountable to their identity and church membership. Okay? Let me just say one last thing. The congregational, not paedo baptizing, not kid baptizing people have preserved the gospel. I went to a Baptist seminary. I went to 2 of them. You know, most of the books that we read about soteriology and the order of salvation, and all that stuff about justice, you know what most of those books were? They were by baby baptizers. Stop the nonsense. The apex in the last 2,000 years of gospel clarity did not come from Congregationalists. It came from baby baptizers. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. Just stop it. You know it. That's why you guys got us reading all this stuff as Baptists. I was a Baptist. You know it. The gospel has been dramatically, not exclusively, preserved distinctly by those who baptize their children. Don't talk that nonsense. Don't talk that nonsense. So, let me just conclude by saying this. Here is my concern, apart from what I've said about these things. Here's my concern. What Dever is saying, and what people like Dever are saying, is that conversion is everything. Everything comes down to conversion. It is this monopolizing of conversion, particularly the experience of conversion. So all this stuff that you're doing that is not about the actuality and assuredness of conversion, it's meaningless, it's pointless, it's actually bad. And this Baptist mentality, and this Baptist spirituality, they monopolize conversion and demonize or make irrelevant everything else. At least in the concept, maybe they don't always work it out consistently. Thankfully, they don't. The experience of conversion, conversionism, is the climax and the summum bonum of everything. And the elevation of Congregationalism is also a troubling thing. And let me give you specific examples of what I mean by that and how I made the connections. This is 9 Mark's ministry. This is at Southeastern Seminary. Now, why is it that a lot of the people in 9 Mark's ministry, Tabidi and Lehman and all these guys, why have they been the ones promoting all this woke nonsense for like the last 5 years? Okay, why has Tabidi been telling us that Christians must vote for Hillary Clinton? Like, why supposedly is Mark Dever, a registered Democrat? Okay, why is it that at these institutions like Southeastern and Southern, there are woke as a joke people like Jarvis Singleton selling this CRT nonsense and calling it the gospel? Why is there flagship, massive, used to be president churches that say BLM is a gospel issue like J.D. Greer? Why do you have people saying that racial reconciliation in a social sense is the gospel? Let me tell you why. Because you have this conversionalistic, monopolized spirituality that makes spiritual something very, very, very narrow, namely the regenerate believer, and everything else is open season for whatever. This preoccupation with converted things, and only what is Christian is that which is regenerate individuals, has led a lot of these men in this particular circle and these schools to promote many things in creational, in regular, in normal life, outside of the individual Christian regenerate in a pagan way. These things are related. They're related. Now, some of you say, wait a second, bro. Wait a second. I ain't into none of that stuff. Yes. And my take is, it's because you're borrowing. You're moving away from the pietism and the conversion exclusivism. That's all that matters is conversion. The whole denomination, everything's about just conversion. There's no concept of Christianity outside of conversion. There's no umbrella of the kingdom outside of conversion. You are moving away from that pietism and you are bringing in the Reformed worldview that sees conversion, understands it's important and its goal, but has a Christianity that is much more comprehensive than the individual that is converted. So this view of spirituality makes all things outside of the converted Christian not distinctly Christian. That's why these guys have a political and social perspective in all these spheres outside of individual conversions in church that is very secular. It is a part of this worldview. Outward administration is irrelevant. As we said, unregenerate church members is irrelevant. So why would you ever want outward administration in the church? Why would you ever want outward administration of Christianity in the public and civil sphere? Because outward administration is pointless. All that matters is individuals individually experiencing, but outward administration is meaningless. As a matter of fact, outward administration, like people being members of the church but not saved, people being a part of a nation that identifies with the kingship of Christ and prescribes his laws, those things are against conversion. They undermine conversion. There is no concept of outward administration as being something that is not the essence of spirituality, but it can be cooperative. You can have kids be external, unregenerate members, and it can be something that facilitates and works with the goal of doxological regeneration. Let me also say this. Egalitarianism is a problem. Egalitarianism is a problem of this society. It's a problem in church. And I know many people in the SBC are not they're not for egalitarians in society. They don't have an egalitarian perspective of society, and they don't believe in female pastors. But here's the thing. If your priority and so important that the gospel is preserved by this is congregational rule, congregational churches, if that is your distinction, if that is what you elevate, what do you think all these women preachers and pastors are a fruit of? A church that is governed by those who are not officers and are not pastors. A woman is what? A woman is a regular member of your church. So if you have all these people in your tradition governing in your tradition, and you cannot see the connection between congregationally led churches where basically you're in and you're out. I mean, and the elders have this. The good thing is a lot of Baptists have brought elder rule in and they're trying to synthesize. But basically, it's a congregational one church is going to always be conducive to regular members like women leading the church. So why do you, when you go to a Presbyterian church, you don't have lay guys doing all these things, and you don't have like the worship guy doing all these things, and you don't have women? Because our churches are governed by elders, and elders are men. This congregationalism that is an apex part of your tradition, I think, has a actual trajectory and connection to egalitarianism. This unspiritualizing of, let me say something. The way Deborah talks, now obviously what's good is that none of these guys are fully consistent. Praise be to God. When you guys do baby dedications, in my own way, I say amen. You understand that simply because they're not regenerate, there is something spiritual, meaningful, ecclesiological here, but you just have this whole way of working it out, even though there's no dedications in the Bible. Every time kids are presented, it's always sacramentally so, but let's not go there. But they're not consistent. But here, if they were consistent, he's saying, look, there's nothing spiritual about your baby. This is just your offspring. Until regeneracy is established and proven, there is nothing spiritually meaningful about that child. 1 Corinthians 7 blows that there is a consecrated, distinct, not regenerate, not saved, but a holy distinction of that child. And in the Baptist worldview, things creational that are not in the world of private conversion are unspiritualized. And it leads to us acting unspiritual in so many things in the creation. Well, I'm voting now. Well, I'm working now. Well, that's that, and that's that. And so this unspiritualized of things that are created which have yet to be proven to be in the Spirit, I think is massively a problem in the visible church today, and even amongst the Reformed. Furthermore, independency, let me tell you something. We live in the tyranny of independency. We currently live in a day and age in the West where independency is a tyrant. And now everything is subverted to the individual. And you have a system of government which makes autonomy of an individual entity everything about the denomination and the propagation of the gospel. Well, let me tell you something. That worldview and ideology, the priority and preeminence of the individual, has led to so much drama in this place that we live. Everybody does not see themselves covenantally. They see themselves individualistically, and now everything is subverted and subjected to the priority and preeminence and protection of the individual. And so the covenantal perspective of civil, the covenantal perspective of churches and elder rule, and the covenantal perspective of household, all those things have been subverted by the tyranny of the individual speaking for himself on behalf of others. And so I think that a lot of this, well, this is my conscience. This is how I feel. This is me. This is my family. This is my church. This is my vision, is not created by, but I believe promoted or not countered and somewhat accommodated by this worldview of independence. Let me tell you something. You did not get the system of government we have from the paradigm of Baptists. I don't care what anyone says. It's very clear, and historically proven that these three spheres of decentralized courts and this representational rule of senators and all this stuff, there's the federal, there's the federal, there's the state, there's the judicial, executive, legislative, all that stuff was through the influence of people not seeing Congregationalism, but seeing Presbyterianism in its worldview and structures. And what has happened over the years is America has become very much more saturated by the Baptistic worldview, the individualistic worldview, the independent worldview, right? And it's affected, I believe, a lot of society. And thankfully, the Baptist world has been regularly bringing in these elements of the covenantal world. They won't go all the way, but they're starting to go. And what I'm saying in this is go further. Go further, because this statement, this response is very telling about how much further you should go. See this, and here's the thing about the Baptist universe and spirituality. They have this radical discontinuity with the Old Testament. So they understand, like, yeah, you gave signs. You gave signs to children in the Old Testament. But we're New Testament Christians, and all that stuff is like Mosaic stuff. Well, guess what? The second you begin to see Israel and the administration of signs to the generation to come, the second you say that's an Israel thing, and now we're in the new covenant, in this better covenant, which I don't know how the Baptists see their view of the covenant as better. All that stuff is gone. So there, blessings and curses amongst nations, gone, because we're in the new covenant. God dealing with nations and kings, gone, because that's new covenant. God being multi-generational, God having a multi-generational purpose for his church and whatnot, like all that's gone. All that stuff is gone. God holding nations accountable to the first and second table law, all that's gone. Why? Because you have this discontinuity of interpretation that informs your worldview, where you don't see God and how it works in Israel as having an ongoing significance. All that stuff has been dropped, and what we're left with It's not nations, families, generations, cities, majesties, and kings. All we're left with in the kingdom of Christ is you, Christian, by yourself. And that comes from this radical discontinuity with creation all the way through law and prophets and then into the new covenant. So here's the last thing I would say. Okay, so I think that to my Presbyterians who have been duped by a lot of this dualistic, Gnostic, compartmentalized spirit, like monopolization of conversion and demonization or neutralization of everything else. So my Presbyterian brothers who have some of this Baptist stuff like in your DNA, I encourage you to really think about where you have this continuity with the piety of the Baptistic world. Where do you sound like them? And think about why. And think about its implications. To my Baptist homeboys, go further. Go further. Don't try to do the. Go further. Go further. Go further. I believe you got to go further because there's no going back, and there's no stopping in the middle. Keep going. Keep going. And my last statement would be is Jared Longshore. That he's like, I guess he's like, is he like I don't know how old he is. Is he like supposed to be like the successor of the Wilson Empire of they call him the Mulan of Moscow or something. I don't know, but he commented on this video. Interestingly, he commented on this video. And so Dever says, yeah, the Reform, they were totally different because they did not collapse. They did not collapse the sign with the reality of regeneration. They believe that you could have church members who have the sign and not the reality. And then he goes along his long list of quotes where this guy said, if you're baptized, you're regenerate. This guy said something that sounded like that, but it's not exactly that. So he had all these quotes to make a case for his quasi-sacerdotal papacy, federal vision stuff that believes that all kids are regenerate and united to Christ by virtue of their baptism. And guess what? That's why you give them, the Lord's Supper and wine and bread. He kept making comments to that. Let me say this. The solution to all these issues in the Baptist sphere and piety is not to go back to Rome, aka federal vision, paedo communion, and baptismal regeneration with all of their jujitsu of words, and I'll explain it. Well, it's not this and it's not that. And no, the way that we persevere through this is through the confession, the Westminster Standards. They distinguish the sign from the reality, but they do not separate the sign from the reality. And they understand that there is a visible and invisible that are not collapsed into each other, not far apart, but connected and yet distinct. We have everything we need to navigate through the Baptist nonsense, the federal vision nonsense, and everything else. We have something very, 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 very reliable. And hopefully what you see in this is that there is a connection with how you view something like a child, like a sacrament, like a form of government. There is a connection between everything else. You go here, you're going to go there. You see this, you're going to see that. So, done. And it was an hour thing, bro. Can you believe it? I didn't want to do an hour. I gotta call some people. I gotta do some stuff. I gotta be a presbyter, man. I gotta work in the presbytery and do things outside of my church, man. I gotta do some Presbyterian stuff. And got me here for an hour. So Kingdom Polemics signing off. Grace and peace. Love y'all.